All right, I'm live. Hello, everyone. I'm Bacon. I am very excited to be able to have my guest on today, Dr. Louis Pulsipher. I came across an article of his that was given to me by Michael J. Pastor. So thank you very much, Michael. In Dragon Magazine, number 74. It's a June 83 edition of the magazine, wherein Lou, who he's asked me to call him, or how he's asked me to call him, mentions the types of players of role-playing games as they existed at the time in 1983, at least as they were understood to exist at the time. I read the article and I found it to be extremely prescient today, and so I reached out, and I'm very honored to have him on the channel. So I'm going to bring him on, and we're going to get some introductions in, and we'll go from there. So, Lou, thank you again for joining me. I appreciate it. If you want to go ahead and just introduce yourself and say, where you come from, where you've been, what you've designed, what you're designing, that would be fantastic.
Okay, well, I have two lives in gaming, you might say. One is role-playing gaming, and one is board gaming. And in role-playing gaming, I'm generally a player who likes to categorize things. And I wrote a great many articles back in the 80s and the 70s, actually, about role-playing games. But I have never designed a full role-playing game that has been published, because I just modified advanced D&D. And that was good
okay.
enough. Why design another game? The one that I have partially designed, and which is not yet published, but may appear in a book if I live long enough to get it out, was originally meant to be part of a board game, with the idea that, we won't need a GM. Well, that's really tough, and that didn't seem to work out. But I still had the outlines of a very simple RPG, for example, so simple that you don't roll for character abilities, you just don't have them. So that's close to as simple as you can get. Uses 2d6, and it's all skill-based. So you choose skills as you go along, and that's the way you differentiate your characters. So there are no character classes and so forth. But that's something I have playtested a couple of times, but who knows if I'll ever get it finished. So role-playing games is mostly articles about role-playing games, especially about D&D, because until game design became my favorite game, Dungeons and Dragons was my favorite game. And my history includes a 20-year hiatus, starting about the time that article was published, where I didn't have anything to do with the hobby. I played Dungeons and Dragons with other people, and I was learning computing to make a living. And then I came back in about 2004 and went from there. Now, the second part of my two parts is board game design. And I started designing games when I was a kid. We play toy soldiers and so on. I'd make rules for it. I never thought about it commercially until I was in England researching my doctoral dissertation. And I think my first game was Swords and Wizardry, which was a kind of Stratego-like game, but fantasy, and somewhat different from Stratego. My most well-known game is Britannia, which is 1,000 years of British history, and that's been republished many times, and there's a tournament at the World Board Gaming Convention and so on. But it's a very long game by modern standards. It's 4 to 5 hours with people who are experienced. And board games and role-playing games are a lot different, of course, but I happen to have my foot in both games. My favorite game before Dungeons and Dragons existed was Diplomacy. And the first time I saw Dungeons and Dragons, I said, I hate dice games. But obviously, D&D is a dice game, but D&D is also a microcosm of life. That is, You can choose to play it kind of like somebody who doesn't run their life very well, or you can play it cautiously. And I'm not trying to judge anybody, but you can reduce the number of times you have to rely on the dice to save your bacon, pardon me, save your life. And some people do that, and I do that, and some people don't. And some people, including me, like to have everybody in the party survive and have the party succeed. It's very much cooperative. And other people are individualistic and they look at things quite differently. But in that way, the game is a microcosm of life. But it's also an awful lot of alternatives and possibilities. And you can never say that you're playing the game just like it's supposed to be played, because even the people who designed it changed it as they went along. So I've designed a number of other games. Valley of the Four Winds was the first game published by Games Workshop. Dragon Rage, which was published in 1982, and I never got paid a dime for that because the company went bust for reasons that had nothing to do with the board games. It was a subsidiary of a miniatures game run by Duke Seafried, and I was told he got in a spitting contest with his banker, and the banker called in the loan, and that was it. But it was redone in 2011 and worked out quite well. So I guess I could go on a lot longer, but that has to be sufficient, I think. Right now, I do two things in games. I'm semi-retired from designing board games, and that is, one, I write a pretty much twice a month column on enworld.org called Worlds of Design. I've done that since 2017. And I maintain a game design channel, and that's the name, Game Design, on YouTube with about 700 videos on it.
The link is in the description for anyone who would like to visit the channel, and I would encourage you to do so. There's quite a bit of interesting material over there.
And that, of course, is free. Now, that's game design in general, but occasionally I make a video specifically about role-playing games.
Mm-hmm.
So ask away. I think I've said enough.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and the history. Absolutely fascinating, in my view. So I guess we can just dive right in to the topic. Before we get to the article itself and the items that you discuss in that, can I ask you to briefly, or maybe not so briefly if you need the time, define what a role-playing game is and what role-playing is? So, because that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and so I find it very helpful to sort of set that standard so that when we have this discussion, we know what is being referred to.
Well, defining role-playing game is really tough.
Yeah, it's not an easy ask. I know.
One of the main parts of a role-playing game is that you have an avatar, which is not common in board games, but is common in video games. And an avatar is some asset. It could be a person, it could be a car in Car Wars, it could be a tank in World of Tanks, that everything you do emanates from. And that is at risk. In other words, if that asset is destroyed, you lose. It's not entirely true, because even in a role-playing game, you can die gloriously and feel that you succeeded. But that's the basis of role-playing games, and that's what I think role-playing games brought to gaming that had not existed before. The avatar basis, the pure avatar basis, because there are partial avatars where, okay, you get killed and it's bad for you, but you can keep on playing, things like that. Or an avatar that much of what you do emanates from, but not everything. So role-playing game, that's good enough. As far as what role-playing is, it's a matter of what you knew before and when. So when we started playing Dungeons and Dragons, I started in 1975. Most of us were war gamers. And war gamers were accustomed to things like Avalon Hill's advertisements would say, "You are the commander. Can you make this happen? You." So not an avatar exactly, but putting yourself into the game. So naturally, when we started playing Dungeons and Dragons, we thought, that character there is me. I'm not an actor, that's me. And we were playing a game, even though it was a game with a supposedly neutral referee, it was a game, not a storytelling exercise. Good stories could come out of it, but that wasn't the point. The point was we were playing a game. At some point, as Dungeons and Dragons and other games of that type became more popular, a different idea moved in. I don't know exactly why, but I can speculate. And that different idea
Please do speculate.
That different idea was that this is a persona and you're going to be the actor who's playing that part. So you need a big background for that character to understand the character, and then you do whatever it is you think that character would do. Well, from the point of view of the Vicarious Participator, which is my point of view, that's nuts, because you might lose the game because you do something stupid because that character does something stupid. So no. But a lot of people felt that was more appropriate. And the only reason I can think of, the primary reason why they thought that was appropriate, is because they were in a storytelling session and they were not playing a game. So as time has passed, we've got a lot of people coming into Dungeons and Dragons who are not game players, and they tend to think of it as a story. And even board games, people think of as stories a lot of times. So they think of it as a story, and they understand why people expect them to act out a role. And the essence of this is, for example, if my character has a low intelligence and I'm a Vicarious Participator, I don't give a damn. I'm not going to do something really stupid. But the people who are actors may do something really stupid because that character is really stupid. That's not a way to win a game. Not at all.
Okay, so
But
it's sort of
you need to be in a storytelling session where the referee will protect you.
Okay. So it's very much well, I'll tell you what, before we get there, let me maybe review a couple of bits in the article so that we know. So the article itself is called The Vicarious Participator, and I don't want to leave people in the dark here on what you mean when you say that. So if you'll just pardon me for a moment, I'm going to read the first just couple of paragraphs so that we can really kind of drill down on what you mean by Vicarious Participator. So please pardon me while I read. I will do it quickly and hopefully not trip over my words. So this is the article that prompted me to reach out in the first place. It's called The Vicarious Participator. Again, it's in the June 1983 issue of Dragon Magazine, issue number 74, and it is on page 38. But if you get it in a PDF, it's on page 40. So in the early days of fantasy role-playing gaming, many players did not role-play in any significant sense of the word. That is, they did not pretend or imagine that they were in a real world different from our own. Instead, they made a farce out of FRP, and their characters tended to act like thugs or gangsters, if not fools. Pursuit of power without regard for anything else was typical. In reaction and rebuttal to this, some players went to the other extreme. They believed that characters, through their players, should imagine themselves as fulfilling a role in a real world, and further declared that each character should be a personality completely separate from the player, so that the player becomes more of an actor than a participant in a game. For several years, these people were voices crying out in the wilderness, but as more people gained FRP experience or heard about this improvisational theater, or persona creator, as you call it, school of role-playing, and as the more articulate and vociferous of the persona extremists found an audience for their views, this extreme attitude about role-playing has spread so widely that it instead of not role-playing at all seems to have become the standard. So instead of defaulting to the, I guess, the power gamer is what I'll call them. So instead of defaulting to the power gamer, the standard became the persona creator. To move on from there, unfortunately, because initially they had to express their views about role-playing with maximum emphasis just to be listened to, many of the people in this second group have become intolerant of other views. One occasionally runs into remarks at conventions or in articles which disparage anyone who does not create an elaborate persona for each of their characters, each different from their own personality. The most hardline advocates of this school of thought refuse to believe that there is any other proper way to play, and they measure the skill of a role-playing gamer in accordance with how closely they meet their notions of role-playing as theater. So we haven't quite gotten to the Vicarious Participator yet, but I wanted to ask you something. This is on behalf of my co-host, Jax, who unfortunately could not make it. I'm going to call it an emergency. So they had to attend an emergency. They are okay. There is nothing terribly wrong. It just, it kind of, it would not allow their participation this evening. But they do send their best, and I have been equipped with a question to ask. So as far as the extreme attitude about role-playing and the 3 different types of role players that you name in the article, has that been maintained to present day? Like, have there been any shifts? Are there additional groups that you would identify? Is there any overlap between the groups that have maybe, I don't know, I guess they would sort of spawn these different perspectives on the role-playing hobby, what a role-playing game is, what role-playing itself is. Is that something that has taken place, or do you, in your view, is it pretty much a solid 3-group sort of dichotomy?
Well, first I'll say I have a PhD in history.
Okay.
So I know history better than most people.
That's incredible.
History shows that things don't change very much in this kind of disagreement or dichotomy or trichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, things continue to be the same. And in role-playing games especially, I keep seeing discussions of things that I talked about more than 40 years ago. And that's not a criticism of anybody. That's just the way it seems to be. Mm-hmm. There's always going to be differences in details and nuance that comes out over time. But I don't, off the top of my head, know of a different way of looking at it. On the other hand, I can't pretend to know everything that happens and all the attitudes there are in role-playing gaming, because role-playing gaming is big enough that there's a whole lot of attitudes, just like in board gaming or other kinds of gaming, a whole lot of different ways of looking at things.
Absolutely.
And people may take a little bit from here and a little bit from there and a little bit from another place. Some of the people who participate vicariously think of themselves as heroes, while others, if they think of themselves as anything, they're hoodlums. And they're both vicariously participating, but they both have very different points of view about what they ought to be doing. You know, when I started to play role-playing games, I knew I'd be a magic user, first of all, but I also wanted to be a hero. Somebody who was doing the right thing, soldier of God, because the gods are real in role-playing games and all that.
Okay, that's a good answer. So, to make sure that I've understood you correctly, it's you take a historical perspective based on your knowledge and your education and possessing a PhD in history, and the amount of time that you've had to examine this, accounting for outliers. You think that it's pretty well similar this today as it has been for the past 40, 50 years, at least insofar as players.
The numbers of people have changed drastically.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Yes, because, you know, wargamers get old and die, And there are fewer and fewer war gamers, in my view. Some people disagree with me, but that seems to be the case. Whereas there are more and more people who don't play games at all who come into the hobby and play RPGs. And they're much more likely to take the persona point of view.
Gotcha.
The point of view.
So let me continue so that we can get down to the Vicarious Participator piece. And then I think I want to sidebar briefly, if that's okay with you. So continuing on, you identify a third group in the article. There's a third group with an attitude that lies between the power gamer, the thug characters on the one hand, and the persona creators on the other. And the viewpoint of these people, who you call vicarious participators, reflects the original intent of role-playing gaming. They and you, who you count yourself among their number, believe that the point of a role-playing game is to put one's self into a situation one could never experience in the real world, and to react as the player you would like to think that you would react in similar circumstances. In other words, the game lets me do the things I'd like to think I would do if I were a wizard, or if I were a fighter, or perhaps even if I decided to take the evil path. So that's what you mean by a vicarious participator. Now, in this particular description, you use the phrase original intent of role-playing gaming. And I think that's going to segue pretty great with this sidebar, because I want to, I guess, first know what you mean when you say war game. So you were a war gamer, you said, and many people were war gamers back when role-playing games were first being formed. I think of wargaming in a very specific modern sense. But I know that that's probably not the sense that you think of it in. So could you describe what a wargamer was in 1983, June, when the article was published?
Well, keep in mind, wargaming is a baby boomer hobby. And Rex Martin, who was the editor of the Avalon Hill General for many years, after Avalon Hill went away, he went and got a PhD, and his dissertation was about that very subject. He described it to us once at WBC. I haven't read it, but he said that wargaming is a baby boomer hobby, and then the next generation, the X generation, had different points of view. And generations are different, and I believe that wholeheartedly, that one generation is quite different from another, even though there are lots of individuals who stray from the generational point of view. So boomers tended to be competitive for whatever reasons. And war games was a way to compete with a game intelligently. There were lots of games around before war games, but most of them were very simple and almost silly, and from the point of view of somebody who wanted to compete in war games. You can think of it as chess, and people called the early war games chess-like, because you had to watch what the opponent was doing and carefully counteract every little thing, or you were going to have a problem. And most war games were two players. Now, there were multiplayer games like Diplomacy, and my own game Britannia, which was pretty unusual as a multiplayer war game when it was originally issued in 1986. Nowadays, well, we might as well go through the generations. X generation worshipped a lone hero, and so early video games were great for them because you had the single hero adventuring, doing whatever. And then you get to millennials, and millennials tend to share, among many other characteristics. And that worked with team video games. It didn't work with war games particularly well. And the Generation Z, I'm not sure whether we've decided what their supreme characteristics are or not. But they're not war gamers in the sense that baby boomers were, and the millennials are not war gamers in the sense that baby boomers were, and the X generation is not like baby boomers. So wargaming is, in that sense, a dying hobby because if you go to a war game convention, you'll see an awful lot of people my age or a little bit younger. I'm 73. Um, because we're baby boomers and we learned that hobby and we've stuck with it.
Okay. Well, here's a question from chat, Sable Phoenix, actually a very good friend of mine. So thank you for being here, Sable. He says, if this is the case, how deeply do you think the game system affects the player's perception of and participation in the game world? Does the mechanical focus of war games create behaviors and habits that would not be considered role-playing? How difficult would you expect it to be to break that habituation?
In general, the rules play a big part, but the attitude of the game master and of the players plays a bigger part. So you can take a game that is naturally a storytelling game, maybe like, Fate. Is that called? What's it called?
Fate, yeah, Fate is a game.
Fate. Yes. And you can still play a war game with it, but it's just, it's not right. It's not very practical, but you can do it. Or you can take a game that tends to start as a war game, like the early Dungeons and Dragons, and you can play it as a storytelling exercise. So, yes, the rules have an effect, but not as much of an effect as the GM and the players and their attitudes. It's partly an attitudinal thing, but partly if the GM treats it like a storytelling session, it's going to tend to be a storytelling session. If they tend to treat it like a competitive game, it's going to be somewhat like a competitive game.
Okay, so a lot of this hinges on the disposition of the GM. Okay, that makes sense to me, I think. So with regard to how the game was originally intended to be played,
well, you know that Gary Gigex put a vast number of comments into AD&D about how the game should be played. In effect, Gary taught us how to play D&D. And so his point of view about things tended to prevail. And sometimes he was a bit silly, like the Fountain of Endless Kobolds, which is one of the more famous things I remember. And the whole existence of a dungeon, which is not very sensible, a big dungeon anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so we tended to learn that way. But Gary had been in the war game scene for a long time. I mean, I was 16 years old when I first corresponded with him about war games, and that was long before Dungeons and Dragons existed. And so we played it the way we thought from the rules it should be played, but people deviate from the rules. I mean, the whole point of Dungeons and Dragons is to play it your way, so you deviate from the rules, and some people deviate in one direction, some in another. And there are lots and lots of different ways to play, but it all originated with what Gary put into the rules to suggest this was the way to play. And today, there are still big-time arguments. There's one guy on X, Twitter, who claims that he's figured out a way to play that nobody ever knew it was the only right way to play, and you're all putzes because you don't play that way.
I think there's more than just one guy who does that.
Well, there's one ringleader and some.
Okay, I see.
And to me, they're noisy boys trying to take things that they.
Well, to get back to this idea of the GM being central to, or at least the GM's disposition being central to the type of game that you play, or even let's actually step back and say Gary told us how to play with the different annotations that he provided. What about going back further than Gary to Brownstein with David Wesley and how he proposed Brownstein, played the first session, and then personally thought that it was a resounding failure due to his essentially inability to foresee the freedom that the players would take in the roles that he gave them to do their sort of, outside room dealings and communicating with each other and sort of existing apart from the GM. And then later on in later sessions, I think session 2 and 3, or maybe it was just 2, he attempted to rein that in by presenting the players with not only their roles and their conditions for victory, but also letting them know that there were only these specific actions that they could take to be arbitrated by the referee, which was him. So that was an actual failure insofar as I've been able to read, because the players no longer they appreciated the freedom they were given in the initial play, but in this follow-up play, because of all of these restrictions that were put in place, all of these limitations that were put in place, it didn't have that same sort of excitement that they had found in that first game. So even though he, as the nascent GM, the referee is what he called himself, even though him as the referee had a specific disposition toward the game, and the game, the second session, did definitely go in that direction, generally speaking, overall, the game of Brownstein seems to had very rapidly called back to the initial session, to the way that the players could sort of freely, intermingle and have their own little side dealings, completely outside the purview of the referee. So while individual games did lean according to the disposition of the GM, the overall game was designed to accommodate the market, essentially, what the players wanted out of the experience. So is there a reconciliation between those two things?
One, even today, you know more about Brownstein than I do.
Gotcha.
And number two, almost nobody knew anything about Brownstein.
I would believe that.
So if almost nobody knows it, it's not going to be an influence.
Well, I understand that, but even still, like, just taking a step back and going at it from 10,000 feet, the idea, I guess, that I'm proposing is that even though the GM is disposed in one direction, the players themselves might, and it might be the entire player base of a specific game, might be disposed in a competing direction or opposite direction. And
in that case, ultimately, there won't be a game.
Oh, really?
The GM and the players won't agree, and it goes away. What else?
I think that could be the case.
That happens a lot today. You get a GM who wants to play a game, and you get a bunch of players who want to be storytellers. That's not going to last.
That's true in a very specific sense. Like, if I am a GM and I want to tell a story, and they are my players and they don't want to be told a story, this particular instance of the game is not going to happen. There is not going to be a meeting of the minds. We're not going to get together to have this game because we both want different things out of it. But I guess what we're talking about is kind of the evolution of the activity, because those people who want to play a story, those people who don't want to play a story can get their own GM from among the players who don't want to have a story told to them. And me over here as a GM, I can probably find players who want to have a story told to them. So while this specific instance of a game is not going to happen, there is an evolution that takes place as the result of the different dispositions of the participants. Am I maybe misreading that? Or how, in your view, do you think?
I guess that can be true. And I don't know the specific history of how Brownstein's tied in with Chainmail, and how Chainmail tied in with Dungeons & Dragons, and how Dungeons & Dragons tied in with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I first played with the 3 booklets in the box.
Yep, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, before AD&D existed. But for somebody, even a relatively knowledgeable person as I was, we had no idea about what Brownstein was.
Okay.
And most of us had never seen Chainmail. I had a copy of Chainmail, but I never played it.
I mean, to be very honest with you, I didn't know what Brownstein was until about 3 weeks ago. And then I did a deep dive into it because I wanted to know
A lot
about
of people like to say, oh, Brownstein is the way it is. But in the end, you have to recognize numbers. People complain all the time about Dungeons and Dragons, but it's the 800-pound gorilla. And if you want to find players, you're most likely to find players if you look for people who play Dungeons and Dragons. If you look for players who play Brownstein, you're not going to find any. You can teach them to do it. It may work out fine, but that is a more difficult problem than just recruiting Dungeons and Dragons players. And of course, I play first edition Dungeons and Dragons. I don't play fifth edition, and of course, they're coming out with the sixth edition now. So if I were to recruit players, I would look for first edition or old school, quote unquote, D&Ders who are more inclined to play a game than to be storytelling. But numbers matter. Size does matter, is what we amount to.
Okay.
And Brownsteins are known much better now than they were back then, because we have the internet and Twitter and so forth to spread the word about them. Back then, we didn't have, long distance phone calls cost a lot of money, and that was the long distance means of communication other than actual letters. So it wasn't so easy for niche products to become known.
Makes sense to me. So Sable Phoenix here with another question, and this goes back to the GM being an essential component, and I think the way that the game was intended to be played. He asked about solo RPGs, whether or not they're actual role-playing games or if there's something else more like a creative writing exercise.
I have not tried to play a solo RPG. I don't see how you can play a game. You can make a storytelling session. I remember watching some people play something, I think they called it microscope or macroscope. They were making up a world. And
Yep.
They had a good time, but it wasn't an RPG. By no means. There were no avatars. They were telling each other stories and accumulating information from those stories. And to me, I don't understand how a solo RPG can be a game, because typical solo games provide an opposition, and an opposition that you don't know what they're going to do. So I like to design nowadays cooperative games, and I try to design cooperative war games, which is very rare. Most cooperative games are not cooperative war games. So I have to provide an opposition, something, and it's usually a deck of cards that determines what the opponent does. If you're playing a solo RPG, either you have that or you're not playing a game, to me. Now, keep in mind, many people will call any way that you organize play a game. And I have a much narrower definition.
I think that's okay. There's room in the world for multiple definitions.
Oh, yeah.
And there kind of has to be.
Yeah.
So to you, the solo role-playing game is, having admitted that you've not played one, you find it difficult to put that into the category of role-playing game, or even maybe game in general.
Yes.
All right. So how does understanding, to go back to the subject of the article, how does understanding the type of player that you are, I guess really kind of what I want to ask is, with these three separate categories of gamer, three separate preferences, I'll say, three different preferences toward role-playing, you would still call them all role playing. They are still role playing in role playing games. So we're not excluding one category from another.
Doesn't matter really.
Doesn't matter.
You can call role playing or not. What difference does it make?
Okay. So,
You are playing with an avatar. It's
so
just
they are, and that seems to be something that you come back to quite critically, is that it involves an avatar in order for you to be role playing.
I don't see how it could be role playing without an avatar, because you have to have a role to play, and that typically involves an avatar. I'm not even sure how you do it otherwise.
Okay, well,
Because I'll give you an example here. I have other games than Britannia, but Britannia is a game that covers 1,000 years of history. 1,000 years of British history.
Mm-hmm.
There is no way that you can conceive yourself to have an avatar in that game, because nobody lives that long. You're kind of a omnipresent, omniscient something or other, controlling several countries, nations within British history. And some people, including wargamers, are bothered about that. They want to feel that they are a particular general or king or whatever. But if you're going to have a game that covers 1,000 years of history, there's no way to do that. If you're covering a game that's about one day, a battle that lasts 1 day or 2 days, you can think of yourself as the general in charge. And so that's a form of avatar. It's not a pure avatar, because in most of those games, if the general gets killed, you don't lose automatically.
Okay. Is it possible for an avatar? Why is it not possible for an avatar to be as long-lived as 1,000 years?
In a historical game, that wouldn't work.
Right, in a historical game, that wouldn't work.
Game, yes, sure. You could do it. Yeah, fantasy game, sure.
Okay. So there's just a distinction being made between specifically historical game and a fantasy game.
Well,
because you can do that in fantasy.
Real world, people don't live 1,000 years.
Yes, this is true.
And you could say, well, there's a family and people succeed each other, but history doesn't usually work that way. Not for 1,000 years. I don't know if you could find any family that remained in charge of a nation for 1,000 years. Probably not. Of course, most nations don't last 1,000 years. So at some point, to me, you lose any avatarishness part of it.
Okay, so but you can have a historical game with avatars that is role playing, but it's going to be
role playing,
but it's time sensitive.
It's not an RPG.
Okay, let's get into this then.
RPGs are always about individual avatars. I mean, World of Tanks is an avatar. I don't know if you've seen World of Tanks.
Right.
You've got a tank, and if it gets blasted, you're out of the game.
Right.
Your team may win, but you're out of the game. It's not a pure avatar, because you get blasted and the game continues.
Okay.
But if you're a human in a game, not always, but frequently, if you're a human avatar, when you get dead, that's it. Again, we can even say Dungeons and Dragons, you can get dead and your side still wins. So even Dungeons and Dragons is not a pure avatar. I'll give you an example of a pure avatar. I have a prototype game called Star Princess. And each player, and there can be two or they can be more than two, is a prince or princess. And their father, the ruler of the kingdom, has died under, let's say, suspicious circumstances. It's a very common story. And so you call upon your followers to raise the flag of war against your siblings, and you have a big battle or a war. And the prince can provide morale advantages in a battle such that you probably want your prince to be involved. But if the prince's ship gets nailed, you lose. And that's a war game, although a science fiction war game, that has a pure avatar. You play, you get dead, you lose.
Okay.
Now, even there, a difference between a role-playing game and a board game like that is you've got units all over the map, and supposedly you're ordering them to do whatever. But it's not quite the same as an RPG where your individual avatar is doing everything that you are able to do, other than talk to your other players. So it's going to swing the sword, it's going to cast a spell, it's going to pray to God, whatever it is, it's coming right from that avatar.
Okay. So, but how is it not an RPG then? Because I guess my disconnect is between the role playing and the role playing game. So what about this particular pure avatar war game makes it a war game and not a role playing game? And maybe you said it and I just missed it.
Rules are intended to be comprehensive, and they are limited. In a role-playing game, you can try to do anything. And the rules, no matter how long they are, don't cover everything. So I remember talking to somebody, and he doesn't like what we call RPGs because the rules are too loosey-goosey.
Okay.
He wants a board game where the rules are clear, at least theoretically. It doesn't always work out that way.
So I guess this would be a situation where in the rules, it specifically outlines player action. And these are the only actions that you can take as a player. You cannot describe additional actions outside the purview of the rules, which is that's where the line's being drawn.
In any board game, the rules essentially are, these are the only things you can do. A game is a set of constraints, and the constraints are quite tight in a good board game. They're not tight in a role-playing game. So I suppose when I talked about what made something a role-playing game, that's another difference other than the avatar is what you can do. And of course, I know somebody, John Peterson, who's written the books about the history of role-playing games. He feels that the key difference in role-playing games is you can try to do anything. And that's not true in board games.
Okay.
Although you can try to do something and the rules say no. But in a role-playing game, you can try to do something and the GM ends up saying, no, you can't do that. So even there, you can wave your hands about exactly what's going on. I remember a young lady I knew, she was GMing for kids, and kids play RPGs somewhat differently often. And somebody wanted to throw an iron stove across an ocean. Now, if you've ever run into an iron stove, they're very, 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 very heavy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, sure, roll. And if you get a 20, you can do it. It was absolute nonsense, but they enjoyed the possibility of rolling that 20. And in a board game, essentially, a board game say, no, you can't do that. In a role-playing game, somebody can say, well, I want to do something, and a GM might decide, oh, yeah, sure, if you roll such and such, you can do it.
Okay. I understand for sure. And it's a very interesting take. It's not necessarily specifically with regard to the disposition of the GM. That's not necessarily something that I've heard invoked when I've asked someone to really kind of define what a role-playing game is and how they behave. But it seems to be a very practical definition. It's based on, in practice, what happens at the table. And I think that makes sense. So what then, because if you said, and this is going to, again, this is Sable Phoenix. Again, thank you very much for being here, Sable. So if a game is a series of rules that act as constraints, what makes an RPG a game and not just make believe? And I hope I'm getting that correct, Sable, that first part of the question. If I'm not, then please tell me. But I think that's what you're driving at. And I actually would be interested to know as well. So if you can do anything in a role playing game, even though it has rules and those rules aren't completely.
Try to do it.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
You can try to do anything.
You
But
can.
there are rules in role-playing games that simply say, no, you can't do that. There are
Okay.
constraints, but the constraints can't encompass everything because the game is trying to reflect all of life. Whereas a board game is reflecting a specific aspect of history or business or whatever it's about. But both games have constraints. It's just that there are more things that you can try to do in a role-playing game where the constraints are do not sufficiently define what you can and cannot do. That's what separates it from make-believe, but it is make-believe.
Okay. So it's a hybrid between make believe and board game or game.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. At least insofar as you've defined it. Okay. Okay. So here's Sable again. Hey, do you want to jump in here and just do this interview? I'm kidding, of course. So the difference between a board game, war game, and an RPG is a matter of scale and scope rather than a difference of mode. Is that correct?
That's a trap question as far as I'm concerned.
Well, explain why it's a trap then.
What's the difference in mode? What does that mean?
That's a good question. I'll wait for him to define it. I can take a stab at it. I think that what he's saying is that a difference of mode being it can be played the same way, but the RPG is, I guess, a matter of scale and scope rather than, or rather the difference is a matter of scale and scope, meaning the board game is specifically defined while the RPG is not specifically defined, or at least in some cases is not specifically defined, which is why the referee has to step in, I guess, and make calls. And would that be the difference that you're naming then between a board game or a game and a role-playing game?
Remember,
and again, Sable, if I got that wrong, please tell me, but the possibility is just I misinterpreted.
Remember when I talked about the only role-playing game I've ever designed, trying to make it fit a board game and decided this wouldn't work?
Yes.
The GM. Even though the rules are very specific, I didn't see how it could work without a GM. Maybe it could have. I don't know. A GM is quite a key, and that's why I have to say that solo RPGs don't make a lot of sense as RPGs.
Okay. So
I've seen people play what they call the role-playing game, and I've seen rules where there is no specific GM. The other players just they talk back and forth and agree and disagree.
yeah, I think generally that style is called
game
GM.
anymore. It's not a game.
Oh, that's not even a game.
No, not in the narrow version. In the wide version of how people use the word game as a way to organize play, yes, it's a game. But it's not what some people call an opposed game, or there's different
Okay.
terms.
So why does a role-playing game, in your view, why does it require the GM as it does? So what is it about the GM specifically, that role that's tied?
The GM has to fill in when players try to do things that either aren't well defined in the rules or aren't defined at all.
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
The GM has to step in when players try to do things that are not defined in the rules or are not well defined. Plus, the GM provides the opposition. Remember I talked about cooperative games and there needs to be opposition, and a solo role-playing game, as far as I know, doesn't have opposition. The GM provides the opposition.
Okay. So in the event that a solo role-playing game, what is called a solo role-playing game, has opposition. When you say opposition, let's actually go all the way down to the bottom. When you say opposition, what specifically do you mean?
Well, an opponent tries to stop you from doing things that will help you win if it has victory conditions, or things that will let you succeed, and tries to do things that will let the other side succeed. It's an opponent.
Okay, so if you can mechanize the opposition through tables, which I think is what I don't know, I can't say a lot, but there have been some. Say that again.
You have to do that in a cooperative board game. You have to mechanize the opposition in some way.
Right.
Tables will work, but they're kind of primitive. There's not very many choices. A deck of cards works a lot better.
Okay, so if you can mechanize the opposition in a solo role-playing game, and there are several that do that, does that make it a role-playing game, or is the possibility there for it to exist as a role-playing game?
Well, I remember watching one of the one of the Wizards of the Coast games that came out some years ago, where several players played against the game in a dungeon adventure, like Ravenloft was one of the titles.
Mm-hmm.
There were several titles, and they had bunches of really cool miniatures and so on. They mechanized the opposition.
Okay.
They were the designers of the game. So was it a role-playing game? I think so. Was it a good game? Well, maybe not.
Well, we don't have to get into whether or not it's good or not.
Yeah.
Just trying to get at the heart of what a role-playing game is in your view. So if I have an avatar that expresses that I can.
What we're discussing is something that does not matter. Think about it. It does not matter what we call a role-playing game. Each person's going to have their own idea.
I get that. No, I get that. I'm just trying to get at what you think a role-playing game is. We're not trying to name role-playing games under.
Airy fairy. I read a book. You may have heard of it. Rules of Play. When it came out, big deal. Blah 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 blah. Quite a few years ago, it spent the first 80 pages trying to define what a game was.
Mm-hmm.
And when they got done, they said, first of all, we haven't considered puzzles at all. And second, RPGs aren't games according to our definition. I stopped reading the book at that point because they'd wasted 80 pages of my time doing squat.
Okay.
Because they hadn't even finished the definition. If you finish a definition, okay, then you can work from that. But they came up with a definition even they said was no good.
I would probably have closed the book at that point myself as well, because you have to make a definition that sort of suits your purpose. There are good reasons to make definitions and bad reasons to make definitions.
Yes.
I'm just trying to ask you what your definition of role-playing game would be, just to be able to sort of hem in the conversation, just so that I know, like, when you say role-playing game, what specifically we're discussing. And I get that that's a pretty difficult thing to do. It's not something we can really do in an hour.
Quite difficult to do on the fly, yes.
Yeah. So apologies for that. But it's still, I think it's pretty fun to talk about, to see what different people view as essential to role-playing games, what different people view as immaterial, important, not important. Here's Phantasmagoria. Thank you for participating. Ultimately, what they were doing was making a framing device for the purpose of semantics, and they realized their framing wasn't even good enough for their semantics. He would definitely drop that book too. But let me
make a bald statement.
Yeah, please do.
Let me fit with this. Ultimately, an RPG is a negotiation between the GM and the players.
I agree with that.
All it is.
it's a
It's a
conversation.
negotiation
It's a
defined by
negotiation.
rules.
Yes. Yep. I agree with that for sure. But I don't think that's all it is. But it really depends on your purpose, right? It depends on your purpose for defining what it is. And so I was really trying to just get at what were the essential elements, maybe not exhaustively, right? Because that's a conversation we could have till the end of time and not really land on anything specific.
Yes.
But just the essential elements based on your experience. So, and I get that ultimately, like in the grand scheme of things, it might not matter. But for this conversation, requires a GM, requires an avatar through which the player acts. So all player action emanates from that avatar, and requires, and it's essentially, I'm going to phrase it this way. I'm going to say requires an incomplete rule set. What I'm really saying is that it's not incomplete. It's I guess the sort of the players dictate the rules, or sitting here in the moment, it's going to be hard to come up with pithy phrase, but it's something along those lines. It's not, the players can deviate from what is outlined in the rules as correct action, because you can attempt to do anything. It's just a matter of making those rulings to sort of hem those actions back in. So I'll call it an incomplete rule set, just for lack of a better term or phrase. And so those seem to be the three essential elements for you. There we go. It's a non-comprehensive rules. Non-comprehensive rule set is a good delineation between an RPG. Okay. That's much better phraseology. Thank you. So that's as good a definition as any, for sure. And I think that it's very interesting to return to the article. I think it's very interesting to think that those are still those categories of gamers, and I'm sure there's variance within those categories. But in your view, and I guess that's why you're getting ready to republish the article, correct? Because it's still to this day. Is that correct?
I read the notes that I saw and I said, yeah, gee, that's right.
Okay.
It's always good to read something you wrote 40 years ago and say, yeah, that's right.
Feels good.
I suspect I was a better writer then than I am now. I don't know. So rather than try to explain it again, I just said, well, let's republish it in that magazine and people will find it interesting.
Yeah. Well, I certainly found it interesting.
I intend to republish all the Dragon and White Dwarf and so on articles.
Oh, well, I'm very interested in that. I'd
probably 2 books. It's not always easy because a lot of them are not in text form. They're graphics. So I think
that can be hard to.
This one, I actually used Dragon Naturally Speaking and read the whole article, and that's the way I got it into text.
Oh, wow. From Dragon to Dragon. So Sable has one final comment. I've already kept you for an hour. I think that we can probably end reasonably after this last question, if you're up for it.
I'll go one more question.
Perfect. Thank you. So he says he would like to go back to the question, can or does the GM role play while running the game? And if so, would not a solo RPG be an RPG with the GM and no other players?
Is the GM playing a pure avatar? No. Even if the monsters get killed, the GM's still playing the game. The GM does role play because something has to decide what the various enemies do. Something I wanted to add to that. What was it? I don't know. I'd have to see the question again.
Oh, I'm happy to show it to you. My apologies. I'll leave it up until you're done answering.
So it's not a solo RPG because there's not an avatar, a pure avatar, again, that you lose when it's dead. So Now, a GM can play Dungeons and Dragons in a way. There was a period when I would have a party go into a dungeon or building, whatever, and they decided to bail out, which is always a smart thing, almost always. Well, rather than have the place stay the same for however long they were away, I would roll some random monsters and have them wander in and roll dice to see where they went and decide how that fights occurred and repopulate possibly little bits of the dungeon. So I was playing a game and I was a GM, but it wasn't a role-playing game at that point.
Okay. Because it didn't contain all the components that we've named as
The
requisite for. Okay. So let's I think maybe get a little bit more specific here. And this is it's just an exercise in exploration. With Sable's question, if I am playing a solo role-playing game, and so, okay, let me try to reason this out. So initially, solo role-playing games were disqualified because of the opposition. There needs to be a GM. One of the roles or one of the functions, mechanical functions that a GM provides to the game is opposition. There's an opposition to the characters, the opposition to the true avatars of the players in the game world. So the question being that it doesn't hinge on whether or not the GM role plays. It hinges on the fact that the GM in any given, I'll say, traditional game doesn't have a true avatar. He is role-playing the monsters. He is role-playing the NPCs. There's no true avatar. But in the case of a solo role-playing... I'm
afraid you broke up.
I broke up?
You broke up, so I didn't hear the question.
Okay. I'll review it then. So in the case of a solo RPG, the GM provides opposition. There's no GM, so there's no opposition. In the case of a traditional game, the GM does role play, but it's not a true avatar in the sense that there's no singular character from which all of their actions emanate. It's a bunch of different characters. Death does not mean the end for the GM, and so it's not technically a role-playing game, I guess, from the GM's perspective, because they need to be joined with the players to achieve that. So
the other element that's missing is what constrains the player. The GM constrains the player. In other words, when the player tries to do anything, the GM decides whether it can happen.
Right,
but
yes.
Just the player and no GM, that constraint is gone. Now, people can be self-constrained, sure. But that constraint is essentially gone because there's no GM.
Okay. So if there's a way to constrain the player without a GM, mechanically, it would have to be. And if there's a way to mechanically provide opposition to a player that has a true avatar in the game, that is a role-playing game.
Like Ravenloft and those Wizards of the Coast games that I talked about. They provided a form of opposition. Yes.
Okay. But you I think you specifically qualified the Ravenloft game as a board game. Am I
well,
misremembering?
It's a board game as well. Because
there's overlap.
You can't do anything. See, that's the thing that's missing. Because you have to follow the rules of the board game.
Oh.
So we could argue it was a role-playing game, or we could argue that it isn't.
Gotcha.
But if we take the definition of the GM there to provide a constraint, no, the rules of the game are providing the constraints, and you can't try to do anything. You can only do what the rules let you do.
Okay.
At least that's my experience of watching people play for an extended period.
Okay. Well, you definitely have more experience in that regard than I do, because I have not watched anyone play it. I found this conversation absolutely fascinating. I thank you so much for joining me. Like I said, I've already taken, it's now been an hour and 10 minutes of your time.
Certainly thought-provoking.
Yeah, I agree. It's been absolutely fascinating. I thank everyone in chat for showing up. Heath just showed up. Thank you so much for showing up, Heath. PH Arbex, thank you so much for showing up and hanging out. It's a very, very interesting conversation. If you showed up here halfway through or part of the way through, I highly recommend going back to the beginning. I kind of started off wanting to talk about Lou's article, The Vicarious Participator, which, again, another fascinating, article. And then from there, because I was maybe a little blindsided, I hope I wasn't. I think that we discussed this before we actually went live about me asking the definition. And I knew it was not going to be an easy thing to do, seat of the pants. And so I am very, I hope I was very forgiving in that regard, just to kind of get inside your thought process on what an RPG is and just going from there. This has been absolutely remarkable. This is the sort of thing that I like to discuss on the channel. I think that it helps me focus in on my own views. I think that it helps others focus in on their views and what role-playing is and what role-playing games are. And that's ultimately what I want to do on the channel. I want to talk about role-playing and role-playing games in new ways. Not that this is really a new way.
Difficult to do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. After 50 years, very
But
difficult.
if it's new to the listeners, that's fine.
Yeah. So I thank you so much for joining me, Lou. I will be in touch for sure. If you would be willing to come back, I would absolutely love to have you come back. Thank you, everyone, for being here and participating. And I will see you all, I think, not until next week. But you'll see me on Discord in the Raven Keep, and I'll certainly be here for the other live streams on Heath's channel. So thank you, everyone. And again, thank you, Lou. I am very, very grateful for the time that you've given me today.
Thank you.
So I'm going to end now, and it's probably going to make me stare at the screen for a little bit like a doofus, but